In any industry, when a professional receives a request for work, they will first make sure that the request is in a form that they can quickly and effectively process and understand what's needed, but also be able to give a reliable estimate. They won't necessarily sit down and try to understand what you meant by the things you were requesting in detail. What they'll do is take what your request was and put it in the form they need it. Software, it's the same way. So that's why we use user story refinement in a professional way. And that means that, first of all, when we get a user story, we're going to make sure that the description contains a very strict user story phrase. As a role, a specific role, not a general role, as a role, I want specific behavior so that I get this business value. And we all know the benefits of that if it's followed. But it's rare to find a group where that's happening consistently and well. And we talked about how effective that is and the ways that that exposes the cohesion of the story. If it's got low cohesion, you'll have to use multiple user story phrases to describe that effort. If it is actually a task, it's going to be very difficult to even phrase it in a user story statement. And so it makes it clear what that request is. It's not something to be delivered for an end user. It is something needed to deliver for that end user. So it's one of the tasks required to do that. So user story phraseology is great for that first step of user story refinement. With a well-written user story phrase, you can then move on to refining the acceptance criteria. It's important for that to be actually testable, and that's why we use nowadays the given, when, and then language. Nowadays it's called the business-driven development language. That BDD language, by the way, was introduced in the industry to improve the communication between a non-technical business person or user of the system with a technical group to identify specifically what this person was going to do to confirm that the behavior they want is in the system. And so it was simplified by using given, when, and then. We quickly became kind of sloppy in how we use it, but if you refine your story so that that given, when, and then follows a very strict structure and definition for each phrase, you'll end up with a great indicator of cohesion. Let me demonstrate how that happens. So first of all, the given, when, and then, and I'll repeat this a couple times, given is strictly the data scenario and or system state before the action to be tested is executed. So there's going to be an action or event that we're going to test, and we need this specific data scenario or system state before we take that specific step. The when statement should be one and only one action or event. Something is going to happen, and we want to test and make sure it did what it was supposed to do. Okay? That's probably the simplest of the three steps of given, when, and then. The then statement should very clearly and specifically identify, I like to put it this way, what am I going to touch and feel to prove it worked? What is my test subject? What am I going to evaluate at the end to make sure it works? And that's usually where I start my refinement of an acceptance criteria. I start with the then statement. A test subject is the thing looked at or evaluated to confirm that behavior worked the way it was supposed to. If we were in another industry, like the pharmaceutical industry, we're going to test the drug, but our test subject is the individual taking the drug, the patient. We're going to give them a specific prescription, tell them how often to take it. That's the action or event. But we're going to evaluate the individual to make sure the drug's doing what it's supposed to do and not doing what it should not be doing. If I'm in the auto manufacturing industry and we're doing crash testing, I am going to be testing the safety features of the car, of the vehicle, but my test subject is the test dummy. I'm going to evaluate that test dummy at the end of the crash and make sure that the injuries sustained, if you will, are within tolerance, within the regulations. The vehicle and the safety equipment is what we are testing. The test dummy the crash test dummy is our test subject. In software, it's no different. Every test, you should be able to identify what you're testing, the when statement, and what the test subject is. And most of the time, the test subject is not related directly with the thing being tested. Let me give you just a brief example. Let's say that we have a login page, and the test is with valid credentials. When I log in, the landing page is loaded. Well, I'm testing the login functionality, but I'm evaluating or validating the landing page. The landing page is my test subject. Testing login, my test subject is the landing page. If I change functionality a little bit, if I use invalid credentials and I try to log in, I want an error message to show up on the login page. Okay, in that case, the login page is my test subject. I'm looking at the error message on the login page, but the login page is now my test subject, and I am testing the login page. So in that case, your test subject is the same. So that's the difference. You might even say another test for login page might be when I use valid credentials, then an authentication token is produced. Well, now that's my test subject, is the response that comes back from an authentication service after I click the login button to submit my credentials. Okay. So the then statement should make it very clear. One specific thing I'm going to look at, touch, and feel to make sure this worked. If in the then clause you see something like in our login scenario, if the acceptance criteria says, well, the landing page shows up and there's an authentication token, that should be an indicator that we're talking about two different pieces of functionality that don't necessarily have to be delivered together. You could deliver one or the other and have business value. There's business value in being able to submit that the credentials and getting to the landing page. There's value in me being on the landing page after I log in. There's also business value to getting an authentication token for permissions and other types of things. So there's business value in that. They don't necessarily have to go together. So there would be an opportunity to split this up into multiple user stories if that type of thing is identified. So this is a way to identify that. Doesn't mean you will split the user story, but at least it shows you, gives you an indication of how it could be split if you guys decide that you want to make these more highly cohesive. So that the then statement again should identify clearly the test subject and what it is about the test subject you're going to verify to make sure this works properly. Be very specific. That's a good acceptance criteria. The when statement, the event or action being performed, that should be obvious. It should be one and only one. Okay? Not this when I log in and I navigate this path and several pages pop up and then I finally get to this one, then I want this result. Instead, it should be, this is the page I should be on, and this should be the data scenario. And when this button, when I take this action, or when some type of event occurs, then I'm going to evaluate these results. So the when statement should be one and only one action or event. If you have multiple acceptance criteria in this user story, and there's different actions and events. Sometimes you'll have multiple acceptance criteria and the same exact action or event. That could be. But if you have multiple acceptance criteria and it's a different when statement, a different action or event for each one, that again is an indicator of cohesion, low cohesion. You want high cohesion. You want to have each user story be about one and only one very specific thing, as specific as you possibly can while still having business value. So by evaluating those acceptance criteria and making sure that each has one very specific when statement, you can help identify opportunities to improve the cohesion of your user stories. The given statement should simply be two things, any combination, the data scenario and the system state. Most every application or system that you'll be doing development for or testing will be a stateless system. Meaning that any page, any screen that you pop up, at load time, it is actually going to go to a data source, collect the data that is stored there, and load. And then you're going to take an action, which is then going to affect the system, usually data. So the page itself didn't get its state from the previous screen necessarily. It's not passed on one to the other. In the old days of mainframes and console applications, apps that ran on the local system, that was different. The data was created and managed on that person's computer, and it wasn't actually put onto a server until after a series of steps were taken. That usually is not the case any longer. Most all systems are stateless. Because of that, when you come to an acceptance criteria, given when and then, the given statement should simply say, what should the data look like at this point, and what screen should I be on? Where should I be in the system before I click this button or before this event occurs? Not 100%, but most every acceptance criteria, you can actually state that very clearly. I don't necessarily go through and explain in the given statement a specific workflow that's needed. I'll use additional notes for that. I'll still keep that given statement to being the data scenario, what the state of the data needs to be in, and what screen do I need to be on in doing this test. Down below in additional notes, I say, by the way, this particular page you can't get to unless you first navigate to this page and take this action, then you can test this page. So I'll put that in additional notes. By doing that, I've already talked a little bit about how you can measure cohesion. Again, a single test subject is an indication of high cohesion. If your user story has one acceptance criteria, maybe two, and they have the exact same test subject, even if you're looking at different parts of that test subject, maybe in each acceptance criteria, but if it's at least the same test subject, that's an indication of high cohesion. If they have one and only one action or event, maybe two acceptance criteria, but it's the same exact action or event in the when clause, that is also an indication of high cohesion. You can get much more cohesive user stories and, again, approach user story refinement in a much more professional way if you're doing that. I hope that you'll reconcile yourself to this approach to evaluating acceptance criteria in a user story and refining it in a professional way and experience the benefits of that.